Tucker Carlson's visit to Moscow in February 2024 became a top Russian news story for several days. Russians had spent so long convincing everyone of their indifference to the West, yet when a real American, a famous one no less, arrived, state propaganda agencies literally reported on what food he ordered. Well, the Kremlin knows how to appreciate its influential friends in Europe and America, and seeks a key to each one from Jeff Monson to Elon Musk. In the new episode of Was, we'll talk about how Moscow and St. Petersburg have spent centuries seeking and finding sympathizers among Western scholars and artists. You'll learn why Voltaire adored Catherine the Great, how a German who recruited useful idiots for the Bolsheviks was eventually forced to flee the USSR himself, and which foreigners didn't fall for Russia's stage set and turned from friends into enemies. The German Gottfried Leibniz was a brilliant scholar of his time. When the Muscovites lost to the Swedes at Narva, he wrote a poem in which he wished Charles XII a swift victory and the expansion of his realm all the way to Moscow and the Amur River. This, despite the fact that just a few years earlier, Leibniz had personally met the young Muscovite Tsar Peter during the latter's first grand tour of Europe. If Peter took offense at the German, he kept silent about it. Eventually, Russia granted Leibniz the rank of Privy Councillor and a pension of 2,000 guilders. Leibniz came to see Peter as a great enlightener and reformer. On his next major European tour, Peter made a point of engaging more with leading intellectuals. Thus, the recipe for taming Western intellectuals was discovered: spare no money and try to reflect their dreams, at least in words. For Leibniz, that dream was the creation of a properly structured, regular state somewhere in the world. Peter showed him his willingness to build such an empire according to Leibniz's principles. However, most foreigners employed by the Tsar did not speak fondly of Russia upon their return, and Peter's successors were not interested in PR in the West. It was Catherine II who seriously took up this issue. The main promoter of the Russian regime in Europe became the titan of French Enlightenment, Voltaire. He practically worshipped the Empress and supported her in almost everything. It was Voltaire who first sycophantically compared Catherine to the legendary Semiramis. The Russian ruler's policies aligned with Voltaire's own intentions and views. He hated the Turks and wrote that he would be happy to lie at Catherine's feet when she captured Constantinople. Like other Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire believed that progress was only possible through enlightened monarchs, and that letting the people think for themselves would ruin everything. The Empress herself diligently worked on her reputation. She personally corresponded not only with Voltaire, but also with other freethinkers. The stories about the philosopher on the throne were meant to create a new image of the empire for external consumption, to not only justify the conquests already carried out as part of a civilizing mission, but also to prepare for new ones. Only a few individuals resisted this grand illusion. For example, another Enlightenment luminary, Montesquieu. Russia can now easily conquer Europe if it wants to. So joked Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who also was not thrilled by the admiration for Petersburg. However, these voices were drowned in a sea of Russophiles on the Empress's payroll. In essence, it was Catherine II who initiated the creation of an entire network in the West of useful idiots, ready to justify any actions of Russia, call for appeasement, and teach others to view the empire and its subjugated peoples through Russian eyes, sparing no expenses. For instance, when Denis Diderot was forced to sell his library, the Empress paid 15,000 livres for it and even appointed him as her librarian. The books were transported to Russia only after the Frenchman's death. Under Alexander I, the West fell in love with Russia once again. This time it was different intellectuals, not those preparing revolutions, but those fighting them. Among them was Joseph de Maistre, the founder of European conservatism, and at the same time ambassador of the King of Sardinia in Petersburg. He believed that if Russia had anything to offer Europe, it was its medieval tradition, unspoiled by fashionable new ideas. Nicholas I was called the gendarme of Europe, and his state a police state. And it was precisely this kind of Russia that reactionaries and conservatives across the continent nearly worshipped. All the more painful was the blow dealt to this illusion by French writer Astolphe de Custine. He came to Russia in 1839 to see for himself the advantages of monarchical rule. Knowing his views, he was welcomed at the highest level, but what he saw with his own eyes shocked him. Upon returning home, he published a book 4 years later in which he shared his impressions from the trip. The main takeaway was that the Romanov Empire was a complete facade, a state where happiness was unthinkable, because by nature a person cannot be happy without freedom. Naturally, the book was immediately banned in Russia, and Custine was declared yet another founding father of Russophobia. In the second half of the 19th century, the Russian Empire had a dubious reputation in the eyes of the educated Western public. But pro-Russian intellectuals found a workaround. To those who didn't like the autocratic regime, they spoke instead of love not for despotic sovereigns, but for their unfortunate subjects, for the oppressed people, for the country itself, for its culture. The translations of Russian works, primarily by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, encouraged a fashion for all things Russian, exotic and barely comprehensible, but precisely because of that, intriguing. European figures who found Western culture overly cold and bourgeois showered the mysterious Russian soul with compliments. The same formula worked again. Artists sought an embodiment of their dreams of the other, and they practically began projecting onto Russia the traits they themselves found appealing. And then came the Bolsheviks, and they made no secret of their intent to topple existing regimes across the globe under the banner of world revolution. For that, of course, they needed foreign fellow travelers. Useful idiots. This term is often attributed to Lenin, though there is no solid proof. Over time, the idea of world revolution faded, but the need for authoritative friends in the West never went away. The Kremlin always kept a close watch on what was being said about it over there, and it knew a rule that still holds true. People tend to believe that a talented writer, director, or physicist must also understand politics, especially if they're not part of any political party and appear unbiased. In 1921, famine was raging in the territories controlled by the Bolsheviks. Under the aegis of the Comintern, an organization called the International Workers' Relief was established in Berlin, headed by the German communist Willy Münzenberg. Its official goal was to collect aid for the victims of famine, but the main focus of the IWR's activities became the promotion of Bolshevik ideology. And in this, Münzenberg had no equal. Under his leadership, a whole media empire emerged. Influential newspapers were published in Germany and other countries, and in Russia, a powerful film company operated under the IWR's auspices. It was later renamed the Gorky Film Studio, but above all, Münzenberg focused on recruiting, or rather, drawing to Bolshevik Moscow's side those same useful idiots. He is often credited with inventing an entire technology, the creation of countless public organizations that proclaimed the noblest goals, recruited as many high-profile names as possible, and then were steered in the desired direction by externally controlled operatives embedded in them. Rumour had it that Münzenberg himself ironically called them clubs of the innocent. Münzenberg managed to enlist real stars to cooperate with the IWR: Bernard Shaw, Henri Barbusse, Albert Einstein. Once caught in the web of one seemingly innocent club, they would then repeatedly find themselves involved in others. For example, once the puppet organization Friends of Soviet Russia was exposed, Münzenberg immediately created another, the Society of Friends of New Russia. Einstein ended up heading this new organization as well. A true gift to the communists was the naivety of intellectuals and their peculiar sense of decency, a willingness to support or, conversely, remain silent at the right moment, so to speak, to stand by their friends. These useful idiots, for instance, helped turn the trial of Simon Petliura's assassin, Sholem Schwarzbard, into a public trial of Petliura himself, who was accused of organizing Jewish pogroms. Among the witnesses for the defense suddenly appeared people who could not possibly have been in Ukraine at the time. For example, the French physicist Paul Langevin, who admitted in court that he knew about events on the other side of Europe only from documents and newspaper articles. Former head of the Directory Petliura was publicly condemned as well by Henri Barbusse and Romain Rolland. Intellectuals connected to Münzenberg zealously denounced colonialism, repression, and warmongering, but only when it was done by the West. The Holodomor and Stalin's purges went entirely unnoticed by Shaw, Wells, Barbusse, and Roland. When they visited the USSR, they were, of course, shown a carefully prepared picture of idyllic life. Some of them either genuinely believed or pretended to. One of the few exceptions was André Gide. He saw through the Bolshevik stagecraft and wrote, "It takes just one visit to the USSR to understand how priceless is the freedom we enjoy in France and sometimes abuse." Einstein, on the other hand, was inconsistent, shifting positions multiple times. He would defend the victims of Stalinist repressions, then retract his signature, then admit he'd been misled by Soviet propagandists, only to later join yet another club of the innocent. He was even invited to work in the USSR, promised the best conditions, but the physicist politely declined. As for Münzenberg, in 1936, when he came to Moscow at their request, he realized it was a trap and barely managed to escape abroad. Soon afterward, repression began against many Comintern figures, including German communists. In the West, Münzenberg became a vocal opponent of Stalin, particularly after accusing him of betrayal following the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He died in 1940 under mysterious circumstances. It's quite possible that Moscow was behind it. In the 1940s and 1950s, the movements nurtured by Münzenberg anti-war, anti-colonial, anti-fascist gained a second wind. As the Cold War unfolded, singer Paul Robeson, poets Pablo Neruda and Louis Aragon, and artist Pablo Picasso loudly praised so-called Soviet pacifism, organized various conferences, and signed appeals against nuclear weapons, while the USSR itself occupied half of Europe and was diligently building and refining its own atomic bomb. Over time, it became harder to play the role of a sincere admirer of a state that was crushing freedom, including in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Many of the Kremlin's friends were eventually forced to publicly admit they had been fools, or even outright puppets in the hands of Soviet leaders. Some didn't break free from the hook right away. Actor and singer Yves Montand went to Moscow right after the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, and the USSR milked his visit for all it was worth. But after the crushing of the Prague Spring, he refused to play along with the Kremlin anymore, and was punished with a ban from engaging with Soviet audiences. Even after disillusionment with yet another mirage, pro-Soviet and pro-Russian intellectuals like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre found a way out, or rather, found it again. They resumed the old trick of separating the government from the people and from Russian culture. History had come full circle once more. After the fall of the USSR, one could fall in love with democratic Russia, and after the rise of Putinism, with good Russians in the opposition, or with the bad ones, if they had money. But the current Kremlin doesn't need to invent anything new. They only need to dust off the old recipes of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and there will always be idiots to play the part.